Wednesday, 22 July 2026. 3 Asia-Pacific AI stories before your first coffee. Singapore's Infocom Media Development Authority has introduced voluntary nutrition label guidelines requiring generative AI chatbot providers to disclose capabilities, safety measures, and data practices through standardized info cards. The framework, announced on 20 July 2026, already has commitments from DBS, Google, Meta, OCBC, and Singapore Airlines, along with 2 public agencies, all planning to reference the guidelines within 6 to 12 months. A companion advisory also tightens how the Personal Data Protection Act applies to training generative AI on personal data, including web-scraped content, making vague product development language insufficient for consent notices. Why it matters? This is the first structured transparency framework for consumer-facing AI chatbots in Southeast Asia, and it sets a template other ASEAN regulators will likely adapt. Builders deploying chatbots in Singapore now face a practical disclosure standard, even if voluntary, because major banks and platforms have already signed on, creating market pressure that functions like soft regulation. The companion data advisory is the sharper edge. Any company training models on personal data, including scraped content, must now flag generative AI use explicitly in consent notices. Compliance teams across the region should audit their data collection pipelines immediately. The second order effect to track is whether this info card format becomes a de facto import requirement for foreign model providers entering ASEAN markets, effectively turning a voluntary label into a market access gate. So, Asian startups raised $42.8 billion in Q2 2026, the strongest quarter in more than 3 years, with AI capturing over 60% of the total at roughly $26 billion, a regional record. China accounted for more than $30 billion of the headline figure, anchored by DeepSeek's $7.4 billion round at a valuation near $50 billion. Deal counts, however, fell toward a multi-year low, signaling that capital is concentrating in a shrinking number of large names rather than spreading across the ecosystem. Why it matters? The numbers confirm a structural shift in how Asia AI capital flows. Builders outside the top tier will find it harder to raise because LPs and sovereign vehicles are parking bigger checks in fewer bets, particularly Chinese foundation model plays that can show revenue traction. For capital allocators across Southeast Asia, India, and Japan, the squeeze means Series A and B rounds face longer timelines and tighter terms, unless founders can demonstrate clear distribution advantages. Regulators watching concentration risk should note that a single round, DeepSeek's, represented nearly 18% of all Asian startup funding in the quarter. The second order effect worth tracking, whether this capital gravity pulls top research talent further toward Beijing and away from Singapore, Seoul, and Tokyo labs that were gaining ground through 2025. Now, Suzhou-based Zhongji InnoLight is gauging demand for a secondary listing in Hong Kong that could raise up to $8 billion, making it one of the largest Asia tech offerings this year. The optical transceiver maker supplies more than half of Nvidia's optical module spend and counts Google among its customers, placing it at the physical core of the AI infrastructure build-out. First quarter 2026 numbers underscore the momentum. Revenue rose 192% year-on-year. Net profit climbed 262%, and gross margin hit a record 46%. Why it matters? The deal puts a price tag on the optical layer that moves data inside AI data centers, a segment where Asian suppliers now hold outsized leverage. Capital allocators watching AI hardware have focused on chips and servers, but Zhongji InnoLight's margins show that optics carry pricing power of their own. Builders relying on Nvidia's networking stack should note the concentration risk. A single Suzhou supplier commanding more than half of Nvidia's optical module spend means any capacity constraint or geopolitical friction flows straight into lead times. The Hong Kong listing also signals that mainland AI supply chain champions increasingly prefer dual listings for dollar liquidity and global investor access, a pattern regulators in both Shenzhen and Hong Kong were actively encouraging. That is your AI in Asia briefing for today. Stay sharp, build well, see you tomorrow.